There is a Big Ten game for Ohio State on Saturday, and that makes Talkin' Tuesday even more fun. This is the Podcast Daily. That's Bill Landis. I am Austin Ward. It's Talkin' Tuesday. It's also probably Defensive Tackle Tuesday if I had to make a wager on things that will have people's attention as we head into the Woody Hayes Athletic Center to hear from Ryan Day and Jim Knowles and potentially Will Howard again. I think that's the way that's going to work, but we know we're going to hear from those two coaches.
Is it Tyleek Tuesday? to figure out
another team?
I'm not super fired up about like the defensive line stuff. I would like to see Caden McDonald play more because I like Caden McDonald. Didn't think that Hiro Kanu played particularly well, or at least not well enough to like double up Caden McDonald in snaps. And I'm not even saying Caden McDonald played awesome against Marshall. I think he was fine. He had won the second drive of the game. I thought he was pretty good. It was just odd to me that they didn't rotate a little more there. But I guess we'll probably talk more about that. I think the most pressing question, right, is obviously the availability of Tyleek Williams. And I don't know. I don't know anything about that situation. I know he was there. I don't know if you guys were able to glean anything or just even like make assumptions based off how you saw Tyleek kind of walking around and interacting with people. But this feels like a game where they could probably get away with not playing him again if they wanted to do that. I am more circling the Iowa game as a day where like they definitely, I think, need Tyleek Williams back in the middle of that defensive line to handle what has been one of the more explosive rushing offenses in the country to this point. So I don't know that Tyleek Williams' availability necessarily like makes or breaks this particular game against Michigan State, but it was clear they need him. We knew he was good. Who knew he was so important to their defensive tackle effort? But it was just very noticeable that presence was not there. So I think there's a couple questions there, and it's obviously what's up with Tyleek, why the decisions to play who played were made, and then is there anything about defensive tackle depth, which was a question coming into the season, and seemingly people felt pretty good about it the first couple of games, but now it was kind of put into a larger spotlight, and I don't think looked all that good, or at least for a couple of drives, didn't look very good. So I think it calls into question a little bit, maybe just exactly how deep Ohio State is there, and what needs to improve to make sure that depth is where it needs to be moving forward.
Yeah, I did not prod too deeply on the status of Tyleek Williams on Saturday, not because it would be a futile effort to do so, although it sometimes is when it comes to Ohio State injuries, but because I couldn't see any signs of it being a serious issue. And when Ryan Day calls it day-to-day, more often than not, it tends to be something that doesn't merit, nonstop investigation. He did not have a cast on. He did not have a walking boot on. He didn't have anything taped up. There was nothing protecting wrists or arms or shoulders or knees or ankles. So I'm not saying that to leave any part of the body unmentioned, but based on what we could tell, it didn't seem to be something that was requiring like a surgery or a long-term recovery time. So that's sort of where I left it. Will we find out more today about that from Ryan Day? I bet we won't. So as you said, maybe that could be a situation that plays out by the end of the week or after practice on Wednesday. We'll certainly be, keep paying attention to it and trying to find out more about when Tyleek Williams could get back, because as you mentioned, I thought that the drop-off was a lot more severe than I ever would have guessed, not just because of what I think Hiro Kanu's ceiling is, or how highly I think of Caden McDonald, or some of the plays that we'd seen Tywan Malone make, or the physicality of Jason Moore. The way Ohio State talked about that as well made me believe that they had a lot of confidence if they had to play 3, 4, 5, or 6 defensive tackles that they could. I think they probably all would look a lot better if they were playing next to Tyleek Williams. So having him back is critical, I think, for the national title hopes of this team. But they're not playing for a national championship against the Spartans on Saturday. So if it's more pressing that they have him ready for Iowa's rushing attack, so be it.
Yeah, and I think Michigan State in addition to just not being super impressive up front to begin with, I think has some injuries on its interior offensive line as well, if I'm not mistaken. So whoever plays should have an opportunity, I think, to kind of put a better foot forward than they did against Marshall. But that was a little disheartening, I think, to not. I was like, oh, Tyleek's playing. That's unfortunate. Hopefully he'll be back soon. But I'm like kind of excited to see these young guys play. And then it was just like, that didn't look very good. So it was part of a larger, I would say, like flat kind of defensive effort is the way that I would describe it. Again, not something I'm like super alarmed about, but just like, man, he could have played with a little more energy. So it wasn't like the defensive tackles were alone there, but if you had to like single out one position group that coming into the game you were probably pretty intrigued by and then left a little disappointed by, I think it would have to be that group.
Yeah, so I think it'll be interesting to get Jim Knowles' thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm.
In the interest of full disclosure, I have requested for Larry Johnson to be available this week for Ohio State as well. I don't know if he will or will not be. That would probably happen on Wednesday if it does. But I think that if that is the number one talking point, and this is, I've shared these thoughts. This is more inside baseball. Like, I don't think that the assistants have to be made available every single week. It's tiresome, and it can be a waste of their time and energy and effort if we don't have things that I think are worth getting into. That can be positive or negative, but I definitely think this came up last year with Parker Fleming. It exacerbates the topic, the problem, the scrutiny if those position coaches or the coordinators don't address them when they become a flashpoint. And if Larry Johnson thinks that Saturday was great and that he has no issue with the guys that were on the field or the rotation that they used, the personnel choices that they made, the way that the Rushman package worked, there's good and bad, I think, for both. I think the position coaches, when those things arise, need to be the ones that talk about that rather than the players themselves, or even just the coordinators or Ryan Day as a whole. So when things go a little bit awry, and you can make a case that they didn't go awry. If you think that the rushing totals were palatable for Ohio State and they only gave up the 2 touchdowns and they pitched a shutout in the second half, that's okay too. But I would like to hear from the position coach about that. And this week I requested it.
Yeah, no, I'm sort of 2 minds. Like, one, I would love to hear from Larry Johnson about that too. Secondly, I think at this point I'm attributing most of what I saw to Saturday to just like a lack of juice, a lack of like being locked in at noon, coming off of a week off against an overmatched opponent, than I am like serious personnel issues or scheme issues. That said, I do think there are things to ask about. It's like we tend to overreact, I think, to small sample sizes, but it's sort of all we have to go off of right now when Ohio State has only played 3 games and 2 of the teams are from the MAC and the other one is Marshall. Like, when things pop up, it's probably worth talking about, and you can talk about it in a way that's like sort of calm and not painting it as the sky falling. But I thought there was some stuff from Jim Knowles in that game that just kind of seemed like he was a little bit slow to adapt to stuff. And I would like to ask him just maybe kind of what he learned about how teams might try to attack him moving forward. Because I think the thing that you do when you do see, and we're really talking about 2 drives, I think, from Marshall, 2 extended drives that ended with touchdowns. Was there anything within those drives that is replicable for future opponents in a way that makes you nervous when you're talking about doing that with much better personnel, with better quarterbacks, better offensive linemen, better running backs, whatever the case might be? And I'm not saying that will definitely come up this week against Michigan State, although it could, because Michigan State has a fairly athletic quarterback, like actually a very athletic quarterback, who to this point has not done a ton of designed run stuff, but Michigan State might see that tape and try their hand at it. And Aiden Childs can certainly scramble. So maybe it was a good thing that this kind of got on tape for Ohio State early in the season in a game that it won 49-14, because teams are always learning things about themselves throughout the course of the season. You might as well learn it when you win by 35 or whatever it was. So, but even with that, like I think there's some stuff to get into with Jim Knowles about, like, I know that one clip is going around of like one play where they were aligned and there was like one guy basically, they left the middle linebacker kind of like on an island by himself to try to make the play basically alone without any help. And I was like, well, that doesn't feel like a winning proposition when you're playing against good teams. So you live to tell about it against a team like Marshall, but it doesn't seem like something you'd live to tell about when you're playing basically anyone else who's remaining on Ohio State's schedule. So what lessons, I guess, were learned from Jim Knowles in this game where they got a little leaky at times is probably the most pressing question for me, if I'm being honest.
Yeah. And I think the same thing can be true for all of those defensive tackles that got in the game. We've all wanted to see them play. And what did Jim Knowles and or Larry Johnson learn about that? How would that shape the personnel deployment, rotation, usage moving forward for this team? I think the way that Jim Knowles previously had described, like using the improvement week to project forward, if that's what Saturday was, which it could very well, has every right to be, Ohio State was not seriously challenged. They were not going to lose that game to Marshall. It was extremely hot. I think that there are a lot of things that the defensive staff could say, calm down, cool it a little bit. And I would be,
yeah.
And I'd be totally fine with that. In fact, that's why I'm inviting them to do so. Like, go ahead and explain the things that we may be overreacting to, or I may be overreacting to, or anybody else. And certainly they don't have to make decisions about what they say publicly based on what the podcast daily wants, then they don't have to. But I'm at least saying, like, seems like the most relevant conversation that we can have right now on a Talking Tuesday, getting ready for Big Ten play, when we know that the degree of difficulty is about to be ratcheted up, if not by Michigan State directly on Saturday, then certainly with Iowa's rushing attack and then Oregon after that.
Yeah, regardless of, it's a step up, right? Michigan State is better than the three teams that Ohio State has just played, and I think by a decent margin, even if that's a team that might encounter some struggles in the Big Ten and is coming off a loss this past weekend where it didn't play. It played fine. It was a little sloppy, but yeah, I think like chill out. It's okay is kind of a fair reaction to that. I wasn't there on Saturday. I don't know how hot it was. I know they were talking about that it was like 130 degrees or something like that on the field with the turf. And I'd imagine any defense would not love to be on the field for as much as that defense was on the field in the first half of that game when it's that hot. So I think that helps explain some of it. And the time of possession in general, I think helps explain some of it. And I also think, like I said this on Sunday, I think if Ohio State were playing a more competent opponent, it maybe would have adjusted quicker on the fly to what Marshall was doing to it. But it was also pretty clear that the offense kind of had its thing handled, and maybe you don't correct on the fly and try to create even more issues for yourself. Just sort of take it into the locker room. When they came out of the locker room, they were fine. The defense was totally fine in the second half. It helped not having Marshall starting quarterback in there, but even with that, I thought it was pretty clear they kind of got a handle on it by the time they came out in the second half. So we'll see. Like I guess I'll eat these words if defensive issues persist, but I don't know that I'm downgrading Ohio State's defense coming out of that game. I still think it's in the running for best defense in the country.
It sure is. It's all about the finer details on the margins of evaluating a national title contender. The other part about the field, I asked Ross Bjork a couple times after we were talking after the game about the heat and managing all that. He said something that no one had ever mentioned to me before about what happens to that field and the rubber pellets when it gets to be at that temperature, that like it's more difficult to find your footing and it becomes slicker than even when there's rain, because they're melting and they're getting higher on the field, and it's like playing on marbles. And obviously that affects both teams, but I'd never really considered that before. And I can imagine that there's a world where Ohio State's thinking, you know what, let's play a bunch of guys, get some meaningful reps, get young people involved, and then get the hell out of here, because this is miserable for everyone. And again, that's totally fine. If that's part of the cooling off and the chill out conversation, I'm more than willing to do so.
Yeah, it was pretty obvious the footing wasn't great, right? We would be talking about our great national nightmare of a punt return touchdown streak being over if Brandon Ennis didn't slip up because of the turf monster. But I assume there was something with the heat and the turf, which maybe is why the NFL says we don't like to use this turf, but Ohio State says, no, we'll install it anyway. So that's good.
And
put it on grass this weekend, right?
Yeah.
Michigan State's grass.
And put it on the practice field too. Let's get all the hot rubber pellets that you can stand.
Yeah.
So the offense, there's plenty to talk about there too. I think it's pretty darn good. Although you were watching the broadcast. I was in the stadium where it felt like everyone in the press box was like, my goodness, this offense is really good. And maybe the Fox crew wasn't as impressed. Am I to understand that correctly?
I don't know what the Fox crew was doing. Uh, I think just like kind of maybe I was misinterpreting it, but it just felt like they were kind of lumping everything together from Ohio State as a sloppy performance, which one, like, I don't actually think is true about the defense by and large, and two, like, certainly wasn't true about the offense. You had 2 one-play touchdown drives and scored almost every time you had the ball, and like the one time you didn't put a drive together was because you took a one-on-one shot to Jeremiah Smith. It was like, I'll do that 10 times out of 10. So like I don't know. The offense was awesome. There was a lot more RPO or not a lot more, but there was more RPO stuff. There was more play action stuff. I think it's pretty clear that is the identity of this offense now. The one thing that's kind of on my mind with the offense, and it's not something that's on my mind as like a potential issue. It's maybe more about a philosophical shift. And I saw some questions on subtext about it, and I've seen some other stuff about like some mild concern, I guess, about the ability to throw the ball down the field when Ohio State wants to. And obviously you're going to have more of that when Will Howard throws an interception down the field, like he did to Jeremiah Smith. But I don't know that I'm super concerned about that. But if you look at numbers like Will Howard, like air yards and average depth of target, like all that stuff is the lowest of the Ryan Day era. So they are not throwing the ball down the field as much as they normally do. But I think Will Howard's been okay as a downfield thrower. He's 3 of 7 on throws of 20 yards or more down the field, which is fine. You want to be about 50%. He's just below that. So like I don't know that I've thought it's been poor. I think it actually looks, on a very small sample size, like better than it looked when he was at Kansas State last year. But I guess I wouldn't mind, and probably will ask Ryan Day whether that's on his mind at all, like whether or not he feels the offense, which has been really humming the last 2 weeks and is running the ball well, and the RPO game is deadly, and the quick passing game is deadly. If the offense needs like any more verticality to it, or if they're okay with doing what Will Howard said after the game, which is throwing a screen and throwing a slant and getting 100 yards and 2 touchdowns out of it, because that's pretty good too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more curious what his answer would be, because I think that the answer is that they don't have to stretch the field as much vertically anymore, because a lot of the conversation that we have about this is like, well, you need to be able to move safeties deeper from the line of scrimmage. You want to get teams out of the box. You need to have the ability to hit the home run threat down the field so that you can run the football. And maybe this team won't have to do that in a way that for the last 3 or 4 years or more, it became a little bit of a requirement. And not just because of like Will Howard's ability to run the football when that happens, or that they have Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson, but like with the RPOs and with the way that this offensive line is playing, which is undoubtedly and unequivocally better than it has been for the last couple of years, and has like more creative schemes. Like Ohio State has talked, Ryan Day's talked. I'm spitballing off of things that you've talked about and written about and everything else over the last few years, Bill. It's like they've wanted to stretch both horizontally and vertically, and the way they were doing it horizontally did not really work.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah.
And now they have ways that do. And like by default, in some ways, like the vertical stuff is going to eventually happen for them. Like that's, I feel like that's where I'm at. And I wonder if Ryan Day is too.
I think he probably is, because that's where I am. You took the words right out of my mouth. But they are so, and again, like it's 3 games, right? Maybe it'll change, but they're so deadly at stretching the field horizontally that eventually everyone's going to start creeping up, and then you're just going to throw it over their head. So I'm not worried about the opportunities to throw it down the field. I think based off of his track record at Kansas State, if you want to be sort of like I'll believe it when I see it mode with Will Howard being efficient enough to throw it down the field, I guess that would be fair. But I think this, again, it's 7 throws, but the 7 throws he's had down the field, I think mostly have been pretty good. There was the 1 interception, which I really had no problem with. Jeremiah Smith is one-on-one, throw it. I think I'll catch it 9 times out of 10. And Will Howard seems to believe that too, based off his answer to a question about it after the game. So it'd be great as if an offense, if you can be everything in the world, stretch it horizontally, stretch it vertically, run it, throw it, do everything. If you're not doing everything at 100% max capacity, I think that's probably okay too. and they're running it really well, and they're stretching the field with the passing game horizontally really well. They're keeping defenses off balance. I think the design has been great. The execution, I think more importantly, has been great thus far. So there's always those margins when you can improve offensively, and maybe this is the way that they can continue to find some more growth within the offense. But I don't think it's a problem, and I don't think it's really anything that has me like looking down the road thinking like, oh, I don't know if they can throw it down the field well enough when the time comes. I still think they'll be able to.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I mean, I think anybody that was trying to defend Ohio State in the last couple of years, they would not have to be convinced. Can this team beat you vertically? Absolutely, and you better be prepared for that. But what they saw probably schematically and in terms of execution for what Ohio State thought it could do to challenge teams horizontally did not ever really exist.
Mm-hmm.
And it definitely does now.
Yeah. Shout out to Chip Kelly.
I mean, it's exciting to see what they're going to do every week. Like it's
fun, like, isn't it? Like just showing up like, oh, what are we going to do on offense today? Because it's not going to be the same thing as last week. You're almost guaranteed to see like 4 or 5 things you haven't seen before, which is kind of fun.
It's wild.
Yeah.
And you know what else? They could probably still run stretch to the boundary and be like, oh, look at that. You weren't ready for it. You never seen that from this team.
Yeah. They're running it, but they're not running it so much that, I think probably now when they do run it, it's more effective. Although maybe the one play call I did not love in the game was when they tried to run that toss into the boundary with, I think, Quinshawn early in the game when we were like on the 5-yard line. It's just like, don't cut the field in half. You don't have to do that. Just run it up the middle. He's going to run through 12 defenders. He'll be fine.
I would love to someday go to a coach's clinic and be like, hey, can you explain to me how this idea came to be that once you get into the low red zone, that like it's always the rollouts that get me. Mm-hmm. Why are you doing this? The field is already compressed and now you want to cut it in half. What coach's clinic told you that this was an idea that you should use to operate down there? I've never understood it, but I would love, now that Ryan Day and Chip Kelly are here, these guys have been going to those for a long time and they know a lot of football. Yeah. Like, whose idea is this? Where did it come from?
I'm sure there's an explanation for it that makes sense. I don't make enough money to give you one. So Chip Kelly probably does though.
Yeah. Well, I was hoping that you might know the answer because you go to these clinics too, but
I don't. I didn't take notes for that portion of the clinics.
Shoot. Oh, that's a bummer. But maybe that won't come up on Talkin' Tuesday this week as we get into the Woody Hayes Athletic Center, but at some point, I'm going to try and get more education on that. Probably going to be focusing more on defense as Ohio State gets ready for Michigan State Saturday primetime, streaming on Peacock. You won't want to miss it. We'll have full coverage all week long. We'll have the press conference later on the podcast channel. We'll have some snap judgments. We are going to have Buck IQ later this week with Zach Bourne. He will also, of course, be looking at the defense. Kings of the North. Is there a Kings of Columbus planned in the build-up for this game as well, or are you guys too busy with the North shows?
No, we're going to have one on Wednesday. I think we're going to do something on like all the Big Ten quarterbacks and kind of like where Will Howard fits in. I'll give you a spoiler alert. It's good.
No.
But I think now that we're getting into conference play, I think we're going to take a step back and look at what's going on with the quarterback position for all whatever 29 teams there are in the Big Ten.
All right, perfect. You can get all of that on all your audio platforms, whatever you use, or of course on the podcast YouTube channel, where if you've been watching, you've seen it here already. Thanks for joining us. It is Talkin' Tuesday. It is the podcast daily. He is Bill Landis. I'm Austin Ward. We'll see you later.